All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our peer exchange in some scenario planning work that we did in the City of Lakewood. We're thrilled to have you here today, and we're going to get started right on time. This is being recorded and will be available afterwards for everyone to watch. So welcome to the Consortium for Scenario Planning's first peer exchange for 2023 and the first peer exchange that we have done in quite a while. My name is Ryan May Handy, and I am a planner and policy analyst at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I support the Consortium for Scenario Planning along with Heather Hannon, who is our Associate Director of Planning Practice and Scenario Planning. As many of you who are familiar with our work may know, peer exchanges are a newer initiative we started a few years ago to allow for academics and scenario planning practitioners to meet, foster an exchange of their ideas, and provide feedback on each other's work. It is our hope to do 2 peer exchanges a year. This is the first of 2023, and the second will be in the fall. If you are interested in presenting at our next peer exchange about your work, that should be in early November, please contact me, and I'd be happy to talk to you. I will share my contact information with you in the chat in a bit. For those of you who are new to our work or who aren't familiar with us, the Consortium for Scenario Planning is a network maintained by the Lincoln Institute that seeks to develop scenario planning and apply it in communities of all sizes through research, peer-to-peer learning, training, and technical assistance. As part of our work, we run an annual RFP cycle where we finance scenario planning projects and research. We also host an annual scenario planning conference, which will be this year, or sorry, 2024, January 31st in Portland, Oregon. So mark your calendars. But we also, as part of our work, have begun designing and running pilot scenario planning projects in communities across the United States. And today we will be discussing one of our latest pilot projects where we tested a scenario planning method. This method was born of an RFP project that created a toolkit that specifically targeted scenario planning work in legacy cities. This toolkit was called Legacy SP. It was published by the Lincoln Institute on our website. It's a free download in 2022. And the toolkit is intended to guide communities through a scenario planning process, but it's also very adaptable. So for this particular pilot program, we selected the City of to test the toolkit, and the team that we built for this work used a version of scenario planning called exploratory scenario planning. For those of you who aren't familiar with exploratory scenario planning, it helps planners and communities prepare for several probable, desired, and uncertain futures rather than using a single version of the future. It also explores the root drivers or causes of these possible futures and encourages communities to consider multiple potential paths to address them or different strategies. So to execute this project and run this pilot program in Ohio, we had several groups working closely together. The general project group was a collaborative effort of the Greater Ohio Policy Center, who is here today, the City of Lakewood, also represented here, and the original author of the Legacy SP Toolkit, Arnab Chakraborty. This was also supported by several of Lincoln's internal divisions. We have our scenario planning team that backed up this work, but this was also an initiative of our climate strategies division and our Legacy Cities initiative, which seeks to support legacy cities. As I mentioned, this toolkit was published on the Lincoln Institute's website about a year ago, and we'll be sharing that link with those of you who aren't familiar with it. Today, our webinar is really a chance for you all to hear from the people who implemented this toolkit in real time in Lakewood earlier this year, and we will be discussing our lessons learned, best practices, and some next steps for this type of work. So now I'm going to introduce our speakers. This is intended to be a conversation amongst our panelists today, so you'll be hearing from them at several different times. And then we've reserved about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. The Q&A will be in the chat, so please feel free to submit your questions over the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. So without further ado, to introduce our speakers, we first have Arnab Chakraborty, who is a professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He is the author of our Legacy SP Toolkit, along with Emma Walters. He's also soon to be the Dean of the College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Utah, starting in July. We also have Allison Goebel, the Executive Director of the Greater Ohio Policy Center, who partnered with us in this project and helped implement it in Lakewood, Ohio. And last but not least, we have Sean Leininger, the Planning Director for the City of Lakewood, who will be sharing with us his experience of the pilot program and how it will shape his work at Lakewood. So without further ado, Arnab is going to kick us off with discussing some of the background of this project and how it came to be. So Arnab, please take it away.
Thank you, Ryan. Hello, I'm Arnab Chakraborty. Welcome to all of you. I see a number of familiar names in the list of attendees. Great to see you here. Sean and Allison are really the leaders of this project, and their teams did most of the work. So you're going to hear from them next. I was fortunate to be a part of the team and to have been a co-author of the toolkit that was piloted. So I'm going to share just a bit of the backstory now, and later in the session, I will discuss some of the takeaways. As a researcher, one of the things I'm interested in is how scenario planning can be successfully employed in a variety of situations. And I've been part of several Lincoln Institute supported projects in this space, including one that tracked the impact of scenario planning efforts on municipal decisions, and another that developed a social vulnerability index to center equity in climate planning. Until about a few years ago, one of the limitations of scenario planning efforts in the United States in particular was that they almost entirely focused on regional scale challenges and in communities that are growing. Now, this is not surprising, of course. Most planning tools and planning research, including my own, have that bias. So when Lincoln issued an RFP a few years ago to look at scenario planning, specifically in legacy cities, several researchers, myself included, were very interested. Emma Walters, a graduate student at the University of Illinois, and I developed a toolkit called Legacy SP to apply scenario planning in communities that are experiencing population loss or stagnation and economic disinvestment. Our research, which included many interviews with practitioners in these communities, told us two main things. One, scenario planning has great potential to provide the forum to have difficult conversations that are necessary to shift the narrative in many of these communities. And two, unlike scenario processes that are organized around quantitative or mapping tools, there was a need for simpler, more engaging qualitative tools to support these conversations. So this explains why the toolkit you're going to hear about the application today is organized the way it is. To give you a quick summary, the toolkit has 4 stages: prepare, envision, plan, and reflect. It is straightforward for the most part, though it does ask the participants to think hard about their key concerns and uncertainty. It's problem agnostic, and that is the community decides what challenges and uncertainties it wishes to focus on. And we'll hear about how Lakewood arrived at theirs. And finally, the Lakewood pilot adopted an exploratory scenario planning approach, though the original toolkit is not that prescriptive about that. I'll return to that comment later in the session. In any case, to wrap this up, for my part, it is one thing to write a toolkit and entirely another to actually test it. So I was thrilled when the Lincoln Institute decided to support this pilot. The team at Lincoln at that time, led by Patrick Welch, went through a process of identifying a community, and we were very grateful when we found Lakewood, and Sean and Allison and their teams were willing to give this a go. So I'm going to hand this off to Sean now to give us the description as he started. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnab. Thank you, Ryan. And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sean Leininger. I'm the Director of Planning and Development for the City of Lakewood. And let me just start by saying we were thrilled when the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy approached us, engaged our interest in doing exploratory planning. We had several projects and topics that were really of mutual interest, that things that were really at top of mind for all of our Lakewood residents. But the one that really rose to the top for us was housing affordability. And we'll get more into that topic as we move farther in this discussion. But admittedly, when Lincoln reached out to us, we didn't fully understand how exploratory scenario planning could apply to a build-out community like Lakewood. But what we did recognize and felt strongly about is that this process could really help facilitate discussion and help us start to work on developing responses and solutions to our growing housing crisis here in Lakewood. Before I get into that, though, recognizing that many of you are from around the country and probably have never heard of Lakewood, maybe I mean know where Lakewood, Ohio is. Let me give a little bit of background on who we are and what we're all about. So first and foremost, we are a first-ring suburb of Cleveland, sitting on the shores of Lake Erie. We were built as a streetcar community. Our population actually peaked twice at 70,000 people. We did it once in the 1930s, and as this slide indicates, again in the 1970s. Since that time, like most Midwestern Rust Belt communities, we continue to lose population for the last 50 years. But where we are today is that we see our population really starting to stabilize at around 50,000 people. A fun fact about Lakewood, we're actually, despite that population loss being only about 5.5 square miles in area, we are the densest city in Ohio. As a community, though, Lakewood, we've been known for our diversity of housing stock and housing prices. This has really been a point of pride for our residents for many, many years, and remains so today. 57% of our housing stock is renter occupied, and 43% is owner occupied. While most of our housing stock is entering its second century, given the age of the community and our peak of population in the 1930s, it is very diverse. It is also, for the most part, well maintained. We have everything from multi-million-dollar homes overlooking Lake Erie to apartment buildings that rent for a few $100s a month, spread throughout the community. Over the last decade, though, like much of the rest of the country, our housing prices have gone up substantially. And we're seeing more and more people being displaced from their homes as a result. Since 2016, the median sales price of a single family home has nearly doubled from $154,000 to $295,000. On the flip side of that, on the renter market side, from January 2020 to January of 2023, our median rents have gone up nearly 52%, from just over $1,000 a month to over $1,550 a month. This, of course, has brought out a lot of concern. It's been expressed by our residents, our nonprofit partners that we work with in the affordable housing marketplace, as well as our elected officials. In fact, at the time that the Lincoln Institute reached out to the city, our city council had just convened a series of committee meetings on affordable housing. Unfortunately, though, at that time, those meetings and conversations were not action oriented. They were really there to talk about the issue of affordable housing and not focus on outcomes. And this is why the email from the Lincoln Institute was fortuitous, as we collectively felt that exploratory scenario planning toolkit developed by Arnab and Emma would really help us advance our affordable housing conversations to actionable items. What we weren't sure is just quite how we were going to get there. And that's where we were thrown a huge assist with the Lincoln Institute, inviting the Great Ohio Policy Center to the project. And with that, I'll hand it over to Allison. She can talk about GOPC and her team and their involvement in Lakewood.
Great, thanks, Sean. So good afternoon or morning, wherever you are. I'm Allison Goebel, the Executive Director of the Greater Ohio Policy Center. Well, so as you heard from Ryan and Arnab, Lincoln was really interested in closely observing the pilot. You know, there was an element of wanting to make sure also that the pilot had all the supports it needed to succeed, right? So Lincoln asked us to get involved as they were starting to finalize the cities that they were considering to do the pilot in. As it turned out, right, Lakewood is in Ohio, which is our service area at GOPC. And then we also happen to have just sort of independent of this work, an expertise in housing policy. And so as Lakewood started to kind of hone in on the project they wanted to work on, which is housing, right, it just seemed like it was going to be a good fit for us to become involved. The other thing is that we were sort of brought on as a coach to Lakewood staff by Lincoln. And we were told very early on, we were not to do the work, but we were there to give a hand, provide a second set of eyes, sort of be the, bounce ideas off of entity. And I think that really helped Sean. I mean, Sean can comment on this, but I think that helped because it gave a little bit of distance from Lincoln. It gave Sean and us a little bit of a sandbox to play in, right, without having Lincoln closely observing it. Not to say that we were going to go off the rails, but just that, some of that freedom is there. The other thing we were doing was just seeing how this toolkit actually played out in just kind of an observatory position, because the question is, could we use this toolkit in smaller legacy cities, resource constrained cities? And so we were the eyes and ears on the ground, like really just observing, seeing like, oh yeah, this seems like a pinch point. I'm not sure if only one or two staffers could do this, or yeah, this seems like a really great idea. So we were not grading Lakewood in any way, but really, again, just kind of being observers. The other thing I should say is that, that all sounds kind of fluffy and kind of big picture. But we did do some very concrete things. So we actually wrote the original project Gantt chart for the work in Lakewood. And I think a version of that will get added to the toolkit in the future. So you can see how we aligned for us, our particular timeline to the toolkit, but I think it's a timeline that many communities could strive for. The other thing that we did very, very early on, we decided with Sean and his team that we would meet on a bi-weekly basis. And in those bi-weekly phone calls on Tuesday afternoons, we would work through the process of the toolkit. And some weeks, Sean and his team brought homework that they had done, and we walked through it and we said, oh, this is fulfilling what, are we getting the information we need out of the SWOT analysis or whatever? And Sean's going to talk about that. And other times we just use those meetings as working meetings, and we just like sat down and did the grinding through. Those calls we at GOPC facilitated and we wrote the meeting agendas for. And like, we just did that because sometimes it's helpful. Like right now, I was the one running the slides, not very well because I have a new mouse, but in any case, right? So like, you just need someone sometimes to kind of run Zoom meetings. And so that was a role that we played. I would also say that, and hopefully Sean will comment on this, but we kind of evolved into becoming Lakewood's accountability buddy. And I say that in the most positive, supportive way possible. And so to be clear, Lakewood was extremely on time and in some cases ahead of schedule at some points. But I think externalizing the job of like monitoring the project timeline, like just knowing, that they could come to the meeting and we would say, hey, the toolkit says we need to be working on this next, help them really stay focused on actually just grinding through the process into, and checking off the list and really then aggregating all the information that they were gathering. I'll just say here, and then we'll come back to it later, that we concluded, at least as sort of observers and also participants, that the process of accountability buddies is a great addition, not necessary, but definitely a great addition to doing the toolkit. Last, we facilitated 2 workshops in the middle of the process, and Sean's going to provide a lot more detail there. And so we worked with Lakewood to write the agenda, and then I and another staffer in my office helped facilitate the session. And we felt like, in consultation with Lincoln early on, we felt like a lot of communities may have limited resources and want to do this all in-house, but may have enough money to spend on something high value. And having a facilitator in those community conversations, an external facilitator, might be useful. And so we stepped into that role in this case in Lakewood. So I've kind of teased some of the actual steps to the process, but Sean's going to talk through what actually occurred in Lakewood.
Yeah, and perhaps I can start with what Allison's point about having an accountability buddy. For us, that was incredibly helpful and helped us stay on track. I'm sure we have some city planners that work in municipalities or other local governments. As much as we work hard every year, every month to help manage a work plan, there's a lot of distractions that get inserted into that work plan throughout the year, and that was definitely the case as we went through this 6 or 7 month process. And it was helpful to know that every 2 weeks that we were going to have a report out to Allison and her team and Arnab, and they could hold us honest and keep us true to what we committed to. So that was a big part of I think why we were successful in implementing this toolkit. So the second part of this, the big part of this, as Allison noted, is we're going to talk about the implementation of the toolkit and specifically regarding the task that we implemented to come up with the 4 scenarios that we decided to explore. And there's no secret to what we did. We followed the recipe that Arnab and Emma laid out in the toolkit. As we talked, there's certainly some flexibility to adjust to different situations, but we felt as we looked at it, it made sense to follow everything the way it was set forth. And so we started with the prepare stage. Arnab earlier laid out the 4 phases, the 4 stages of the toolkit. In the prepare stage, we conducted 4 different analyses. The first was a SWOT analysis. So your traditional strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat analysis as it pertains to, in our case, affordable housing. We also did stakeholder mapping to help us identify and really take a 360-degree perspective of who needs to be involved or who should be involved in this process as we move it forward. We also did quantitative data polls and analysis, and this is another place where GOPC was really helpful to us because they could direct us to some data sources that we weren't as familiar. Or a lot of us are generalist city planners, and we were getting really focused into a particular topic. And we knew where to find a lot of the basic information, but some of that really detailed information, it takes pretty deep dives into issues like affordability. We weren't as familiar, and GOPC helped us find that data and also help us analyze that data. And the last thing we did was we held interviews. And actually we did these mostly by email. And that worked really well for us. We got back well thought out, concrete answers on timelines that worked for the interviewees. And I think that was helpful to them as we didn't have to pry too much to extract some information and feedback from those interviewees. So, and all this work was ultimately trying to lead us into and through the preparation stage was leading us to this establishing a focal question of how do we ensure affordable housing for all Lakewood residents now and in the future. It's a big question. It's a complicated question, but that's what we were trying to unlock through this exploratory scenario planning exercise. And that really helped push us then into the envision stage. As part of the envision stage, we held 2 workshops in one day. We had one in the morning and another one in the afternoon. As part of that, we invited all 11 stakeholders that came from a variety of backgrounds working in our local affordable housing market, and include representatives from, we had our local community development corporation, it's called Lakewood Alive. We had some local housing providers. We had an affordable housing developer. We also had a nonprofit organization that is a fair housing rights advocate. That was really important to make sure that we had that resident side, that resident input involved in the project. Our local school district was there at the table, as was a major local mortgage lender that works in this field. GOPC graciously wrote the agenda and co-facilitated the workshop with me. And Arnab, unfortunately, was I think in the middle of January. He though graciously agreed to drive cross country from Illinois and joined us at the workshop and observed and provided some valuable feedback to us as we worked through the process that he and Emma laid out. So that morning workshop really set the stage for the scenario discussion. We developed a vision for housing affordability in Lakewood. We also identified threats that would impact that vision, which was an incredibly helpful exercise to work through. But then in the afternoon, we spent working through the 4 scenarios that we had developed. And in both sessions, though, what's important for us was that we divvied up the stakeholders into 2 groups of about 6, with city staff sprinkled into each of those groups, really to keep it small and make sure everybody had a chance to talk and provide input. We were also very careful when we laid out those groups about how we made assignments to make sure we had a range of perspectives. So we didn't have all the housing providers and developers on one table and everybody else on the other. We also looked at the personalities that were made up each one of those individuals to make sure that they were a good mesh within each of those subgroups. And we actually made a couple of changes based on those personalities. So it was a good thought process to go through that. Ultimately, though, the 4 scenarios that we came up with were set along two axes. On the vertical was growth, so we're looking at growth, low growth to high growth, and then on the horizontal, looking at affordability from low affordability to a high affordability. I won't go through each one of these scenarios, but from the one extreme to the other, the first scenario was what happens if Amazon 2.0 comes to town. If you remember, Amazon had their second headquarters competition that they were looking at. And actually, when we were going through this exercise, this came to life in Central Ohio when Intel announced that they were bringing $1 billion of investment and 10,000 jobs to Central Ohio. So they're living this reality, or starting to live this reality in Central Ohio right now, with a huge demand on housing, which is creating then a low affordability. On the other extreme, though, we look back in time and look back to the Great Recession in 2008 when the housing market fell apart. And so that was our low growth, almost probably decline at that point, at least for the Cleveland region, especially the eastern communities and neighborhoods and suburbs. But then we have high affordability. And then the other scenarios kind of fill in the gaps in between. So in the afternoon, the two small groups explored each of these scenarios, and they did that for about 20 minutes. And they actually went in the opposite order of discussion. What I mean by that is as you see on the screen, each scenario is labeled A, B, C, D. So the first group started at D and worked their way counterclockwise for DCBA. And the other group started at A and worked their way clockwise to A, B, C, D. And this was an important distinction, and I think was a great suggestion from GOPC and Arnab to help ensure that when we brought these groups back together for a full group debrief, we had a thoughtful conversation on each scenario. Oftentimes when we go through these exercises, everybody starts at one point, they get hung up on one particular topic and they don't spend as much time on those later items, or in this case, the scenarios. And then sometimes recognizing we were asking people to dedicate a whole day to us, there could have been some burnout that was starting to happen later in the day. And so this was a good way to counteract that. And I think we were successful as a result of making those changes. So I'm going to shift gears one more time. We're going to talk for a few minutes about the outcomes from the workshop and the exploratory scenario planning process. First and foremost, we were very happy with the workshop and the process. We got excellent feedback on issues the city is facing to address housing affordability. We also identified specific steps that no matter our future need to happen. And this was very different than a traditional planning process that's linear focused, almost regardless of the future. We rallied affordable housing stakeholders and got them more organized than they had been previously, even just by getting them in the room to talk to each other, which we presumed was happening often. Unfortunately, as sometimes when we presume, we were wrong, and this was the case. They weren't talking to each other, especially in a post-COVID world. So having them in the same room and to share ideas and bounce ideas, that started to get some really good ideas flowing, and sets the stage for some future discussions. After the workshop, we took probably closer to 3 months, Allison, sorry, to write the report that would ultimately prioritize and guide our actions at the city. And also going to be shared with our partners, elected officials, and the public. And later on, I'll share a link for the plan so you can see the full thing, rather than just the cover sheet that you're looking at right now. So the report that we developed also memorialized the process that we went through. We thought that was important to capture this process because it's not a traditional planning process the city has followed in the past. And this is what the toolkit calls the plan stage. Following the plan stage and having the draft document put together, we then circulated it with the workshop attendees and the mayor as part of the reflect stage, and it's really to offer everyone an opportunity to respond and comment, give them the chance to think through again what we had covered and what we had come up with. Given the effort that went into the previous stages, we did receive a tremendous amount of positive feedback during the reflect stage. About the process, about the data analysis, and some recommended action items that were an output of the scenarios. We also received some constructive feedback and made some tweaks as a result of some of the comments that we received during that reflect stage. So that then, let me wrap up on my part and talk a little bit about our implementation of the toolkit and sharing some of our results. We are just now wrapping up, as you saw, the date on that was May 2023. So we've just wrapped up the report, but we've jumped right in. We actually advanced a few things, and I'll highlight a couple of those. I think for us, still one of the key accomplishments was that we advanced our conversations on affordable housing to a focused, actionable report. Previously, as I shared, we were having a series of disparate meetings that were focused on issues and not outcomes. This got us focused in on outcomes. As part of this, we developed 7 vision statements about housing affordability in our community. What's important about those is they are executable and they were transferable across a variety of scenarios. And while we need to comprehensively rewrite our zoning code to eliminate barriers to affordable housing and to incentivize the development of affordable housing, our project did result in us expediting 2 code changes. The first was to remove a restriction that is a barrier to creating new housing opportunities in the city. And this impacts nearly 6,000 homes in our community. And I'm happy if people want to dive into that more later, I'm happy to talk more about that. The second was to increase our lot coverage allowances to support additional units, to support aging in place, and to support shared living. So a couple of those topics aren't necessarily directly related to this report, but other items that were of importance to the city with aging in place and shared living. Later this month, it's actually tomorrow, I think, we're going to be meeting internally to begin a process to simplify and reprioritize our community development programs, something we haven't done in many, many years, if not decades. We're also going to reevaluate our tax abatement program that supports the creation of affordable housing to understand how we can make it more effective and more efficient in creating affordable housing units in the city. Because right now it's really limited to large scale residential projects, of which right now there's only about 3 projects in the community that we can envision happening in the foreseeable future. We're also working with our stakeholders to educate landlords on housing vouchers. This was a really important topic that came out of our conversations. A lot of houses in Ohio, landlords don't have to accept housing vouchers, and many landlords do not accept them. So we thought we needed to spend more time educating our landlords about what that means and what a housing voucher is. And another important topic was to regularly fund the city's land acquisition fund to prepare us to be able to acquire property, to take advantage of housing opportunities and create affordable housing in the community. As a build out community, sometimes the city has to step in and acquire property to help make some things that we want to see happen. So we're fortunate our city council has supported a land acquisition fund in the past, and we expect them to continue to do that as we move in the future. And so these are just a few of the highlights for the report. Again, I'll drop a link of the full report in the chat once I hand off here to Arnab to talk about our lessons learned.
Great. Thank you, Sean. As I'm sure you all can hear in Sean's comments and report, this project has been a tremendous success so far. Sort of touches on zoning, affordable housing programs, all sorts of additional efforts in that area now and in the future. In my sort of preliminary assessment, this is for several reasons. First of all, it starts with the right team. The City of Lakewood committed real time and real expertise on the project, and Allison and GOPC were a perfect complement to this effort. And I think that's really, really shown in the success of this project. The team also spent a significant effort in identifying the right focal question, which was, as you might recall, preservation of affordable housing now and in the future. A lot of scenario processes, when led by models or quantitative tools, can be bound by the constraints of these tools. We were not. Also, a lot of time, long-range planning processes tend to lose appeal of their disconnect from present on-the-ground issues. This project was not. It was really connected with issues that are of interest currently in the community and thinking far out about what their implications could be. The focus on housing affordability and affordable housing also helped engage a wide range of stakeholders, as you heard Sean say earlier. We did a post-workshop survey, which confirmed that almost all participants found the issues relevant and the discussions meaningful and timely. Indeed, some of them even said that this was the first time they have been engaged in such an important topic with an open dialogue that involves such a range of affected groups, which was a real, I think, hallmark of success. Also, as Sean discussed earlier, the project was really successful in identifying widely different yet plausible futures through this exploratory scenario planning process, which helped participants see new possibilities and even threats. And this was helpful, I think, in identifying some strategies that could work across all of those futures, as well as some ideas to consider further if the community, say, starts to go down one of the less likely or less desirable paths. This sort of outcome is really the strength of employing exploratory scenario planning approach, and was really seen to be effective here. A couple of more general comments. Scenario planning, as many of you probably have also felt, can be complicated and confusing, especially exploratory scenario planning, which is a new idea in many regards. So I think it's important to keep the focus on the issues in the community and the opportunities and assets of the community. So one of my takeaways is to simplify the terminology and meet the stakeholders where they are. It was a huge help, in fact, to have Allison's group as part of this team. Since they are not traditional planners, they kept pushing us on clarifying the language often, like what does it mean? Overall, I would say that this is a great case study for any legacy city and smaller cities experiencing population stagnation, economic loss, or the possibility of that. Now, I wouldn't expect anyone to follow any toolkit to the T, but many of the principles that we employed here can perhaps be incorporated in a variety of processes, like your comp planning process, or as a precursor to a problem-focused strategy exercise, or even as part of a grant application process that shows you have done the homework. Hopefully we'll have time later on in this session to have more Q&A around that, but those are some of my initial sort of observations around the takeaways from this project. I'm going to turn it over back to Allison, I think.
Thanks. In terms of the lessons learned from our perspective, I'll start big picture and just say that Lakewood was extremely high capacity, very dedicated to this process, allocated staff members, and I think that helped this project stay very much on time and ahead of schedule. Many of the smaller legacy cities that we work with in Ohio don't even have 5 planners on staff. So I think that said, though, I think this toolkit is very doable with 1 or 2 staff people in charge of it, right? And so just to say that, like, that we concluded that this could be carried forward in a range of communities, as Arnab and Sean are saying, we also would agree that that can happen. The other comments I have are really kind of drill downs on the workshops, maybe because we were so sort of external facing in those moments. But one thing, as I said earlier, we agreed early on that if a community had limited funds, maybe a high and best use of those dollars might be to have a facilitator come in and kind of help with that conversation. So just to reiterate, I think that is a good use. That said, Sean Sean and my office wrote the agenda, and Sean and I co-facilitated the workshops, and that was really helpful. Now, in some communities that we work in, sometimes it's helpful for us to come in as the third party and just kind of run the show, right? And that's often there's tension, or like we got to build consensus. But for Lakewood, it was really obvious to me that it was helpful for this process to have a familiar face leading the conversations, both in the small group and in the full group debriefs. Like, community members and community partners trust Sean, and it was good that he was there sort of, driving the ship. I will say that we realized about 45 minutes into the workshop day that we should have provided participants in advance with a brief high-level explanation of what scenario planning is and what exploratory scenario planning is, and like what are the benefits. And I say that because it became really obvious that if people wanted to give the city feedback, and they had ideas about affordable housing, but they were a little thrown at first by the structure of the exploratory scenario planning process of like, let's envision the future. This is the focal question that we want to work through. Here are the 4 scenarios. Like, switching gears out of the usual sort of planning process took a little time. The other thing is that that exploratory scenario planning in particular, has us thinking about a range of futures. And without having done that preparatory work with participants, we did struggle with a few folks to kind of get them to let go of reality, right? Like, we would say, okay, like the Amazon 2.0 or something just as big is coming. And they'd say, that's not gonna happen, that would never happen, or we would never have the resources at that scale, right? And so we'd have to, so I think if we had done some preparatory work ahead of time, we could have gotten through those conversations more quickly. And to be fair, like, you know, those are fair comments and concerns, but we, you know, for the purposes of doing the exercise, we wanted to kind of lift people's eyes further up. So that, those were, again, it's kind of in the weeds, but maybe helpful if you're going to be carrying this forward. Sean, I think you had a few questions, and then we're going to open up for Q&A.
Yeah, so I'll just real quick run through some of the lessons learned that from my perspective. And first of all, I couldn't agree more with the comments about educating the stakeholders in advance. We still had great outcomes. However, this would add some efficiency to that initial startup of the workshop. So I'm going to focus maybe more on my personal experience, not necessarily that of the city, but that probably trickled into the experience of the city. As Arnab and Allison know, I struggled a bit early in this process, despite being a city planner with 20 years of experience, over 20 years of experience. I read the toolkit. I researched how others were applying this process, but it just wasn't coming to me naturally. And the reason I struggled is I don't think I really changed how I was approaching that process or this process. The city planners were so entrenched in the traditional city planning process where we're often focused on a single outcome of the vision, and everything we do is within that traditional framework are to develop actions that will achieve this vision, regardless of changes and inputs as time passes. It's a very linear process. So I needed to rewire my brain a bit and break out of that mold. And I think Allison noted, by the time the workshop rolled around, I started to get there, and everything started to click for me, and how we as city planners can really use this exploratory scenario planning process, this toolkit, to develop better plans and solutions that are really more responsive to the dynamic world that we live in. Certainly still a place for traditional planning process, but this is a great and new tool now that we have in our toolbox here in Lakewood, and it's one I anticipate we're going to use again. It brings me to a last point. Allison made this about staff time or staff commitment of staff, and we are fortunate that we have a robust planning staff here in Lakewood, Ohio. I would just agree that we could probably do this with 1 or 2 staff members, because that's ultimately kind of what finished our project. The reason we threw so many resources at this initially is because probably my uncertainty, my unfamiliarity with what we were doing. And also the fact that we had an accountability buddy in GOPC that we had to make sure we stayed on track. So we ultimately though could have done that with a lot less resources. And as the project progressed, we started to roll back some of the resources that were committed to this. And so we were just fortunate we're to be in the position where we started. So those are kind of my lessons learned. And so I'm turning it back. I don't know if I'm going to Ryan for any Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you all to our panelists for this great discussion. We're going to open this up now for Q&A. So please submit your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will try to answer them live or in the chat. I think I'm going to get things started. Sean, kind of picking up from where you left off, we get a lot of questions about how you can incorporate exploratory scenario planning into existing planning processes. And I think a lot of municipalities really struggle to answer that, particularly since, as you said, there's so many things that they have to. I'm wondering if you can maybe offer a couple tips on ways that you think it can kind of plug into some of the other work that you have to do as a municipal planning department.
So one of the ways that we're looking at potentially using exploratory planning process moving forward is we just recently adopted a climate action plan. As part of that climate action plan, there's a number of, it lays out a number of big steps that the city needs to take in order to become as near net zero as we can by 2050 and become a more resilient community. Within each one of those, there's going to be smaller planning processes that have to take place. I really think we can take this process to help lead us into how do we develop pilot projects for adapting some of our residential neighborhoods for climate resilience. So we're already looking to see how we can do that. I think there's ways where we can incorporate it in that regard, and also just some of the larger conversations that we're having on various topics in the community where probably doesn't work for necessarily a park plan, but some of the other larger topics that we're dealing with as the community can help us move into a more action-oriented and adaptable plan that's going to be successful moving forward.
Great, thanks so much for that response. So we have for Sean yet again. Curious to know if and how you structured the reflect stage and when you distributed the report with officials and the public. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So as far as the stakeholders and how we distribute to them, we did a lot of the back end outside of the workshop. We did electronically, and so we did it via email and pushed out the document for everybody to comment on. We stayed in touch. In that case, we actually did push that a couple of times. That was some good coaching on the part of Arnab and Allison to help us keep it fresh at top of mind to keep it moving. The public rollout is actually just starting to happen. The link I just posted in the chat went live today. So we are just now starting the rollout to the public. That's how new the plan is. So we're pushing our rollout to the public, and we're pushing a rollout to our city council. We kept them advised during the process that we were going through this. So they're aware of it. So we're also going to get the document now in front of them. And what we expect will happen is that'll be put in front of one of their committee meetings, probably the same committee that met previously. And we'll have probably a robust discussion on the plan and the action items that came out of it.
Great, fantastic. Thanks so much. So just to remind everyone, Sean put a link to that report in the chat. It is live. You can read it. Also, this question came up. There are CM credits available for certified planners through this, which is great for all of us. And the recording of this will also be available in 48 hours. So let's take it to another question. This one for Allison. You had a front row seat in the scenario planning process, and I'm curious, will you be incorporating scenario planning into your future consulting work that you do with other Ohio communities?
Yeah, we will. There were elements of the scenario planning toolkit that we were already using in the work that we do. And just to be clear, yes, we are not like traditional hardcore planners like many of you. I have a staffer who's in the process of getting AICP accreditation, and we've had AICP accredited staff in the past. But we often go into communities to kind of help advise on the strategy, on the strategic level. But so much of that is about kind of what is the future that you want, what are all the uncertainties that might face this community. And so, yeah, we do anticipate using portions of, really helpful tools. I mean, some of the very concrete stuff of like ABCD, DCEDE, like just some of that, but also the bigger sort of process of trying to push past expectations and horizon, assumed horizons. We are going to be using, because we found this really helpful, and we were amazed at how much just like thinking and sort of shifting of views were occurring in the workshop, and all for the positive.
That's a great point, Allison. I've often heard that one of the outcomes of exploratory scenario planning and scenario planning in general is the process and the way it changes the way you think. It's not just the action items and strategies that come out of it. So it's good to hear that reflected. Another question for Arnab. You said you did a survey of the workshop participants, and did any of that feedback from the survey give you ideas for tweaks or changes to this toolkit or future toolkits or work that you do in this area?
Yes, good question. So we received a lot of helpful feedback from the participants. Some were around sharing information ahead of time so folks can come prepared and there is sort of a common baseline. Allison and Sean already referred to this in the conversation earlier, so I think that would be a useful thing to incorporate. Some folks talked about, developing and sharing a baseline scenario ahead of time and potentially comparing other possibilities relative to that baseline scenario. This is more of the normative scenario planning approach where you come with baseline and then compare a few other archetypes to that. There are trade-offs to that approach. I can see that baseline scenario being helpful if shared in advance as a grounding information that could be compared against other possibilities. But at the same time, it kind of loses the discursive, open, exploratory aspects of the more exploratory scenario planning approach. So I think that really depends on the community and, you know, whether they need to rally folks around a central vision or whether they really need to openly explore different possibilities. They could choose one path or the other. I think the toolkit, perhaps as it is right now, or with some tweaks, could be catered to both of those possible sets of interests. One other thing that has come up, I think, in our conversations, as well as some feedback, is whether the toolkit should be more prescriptive. As I said, it's sort of context agnostic, problem agnostic. It really encourages the communities to have an open dialogue around, is you know, affordable housing the key issue that you want to tackle, or is it something else like transportation, infrastructure, climate? Right now, the goal is to cater to all possibilities, you know, given that the importance or relative importance of them vary from place to place. But I could imagine future toolkits that are more focused on at least some of those areas that take a step further in saying, okay, if you want to do affordable housing, make sure you incorporate, you know, these ideas and engage folks from banking, from rental side, from you know, folks who cater to the unhoused population, et cetera. So there are trade-offs, but I think the toolkit could be refined to develop more focused and more prescriptive applications in dedicated areas within the larger domain of planning.
Great. And another question for Arnab. I mean, this toolkit was designed as a special guidebook for legacy cities. So could you talk a bit about why legacy cities might need their own tool or toolkit and guiding process through scenario planning? Why target them specifically?
Sure, that's a great question. You know, like I was briefly mentioning at the beginning, we have a lot of tools and a lot of history of working in communities that are growing fast and how to manage that growth and the change that comes with that growth. And it's just a different kind of a climate to, you know, manage more of a problem of plenty, so to speak, and how to allocate resources to maintain, you know, the quality of life, or not to deplete natural resources that tend to take the back seat when it comes to other, you know, pursuing of economic resources and jobs and such. The issues that we, and I think this started from the original Lincoln RFP call emphasis, was to, you know, come up with a framework that encourages discussion of the possibility of decline or loss in the context of planning, which is not done traditionally. Lakewood is on a spectrum of communities, is probably not in a similar space or facing the kind of challenges that some communities are, that continue to lose population precipitously, or that continue to, you know, hemorrhage jobs. So even within the broader, I think, umbrella of legacy cities, we'll find a lot of variation. But on that broader side of the spectrum, our emphasis was really to facilitate conversations around, you know, what are the possible challenging futures that the communities should anticipate and be as prepared as they can for them. So if you recall the quadrant that Sean showed earlier, two sides of it are, you know, each side of the X and Y quadrants kind of explicitly acknowledges, you know, the problem with affordability and the problem with low economic growth, or no or negative economic growth. And those are dialogues that many communities are reluctant to have or are challenging to have given the political climate, and important issues tend to get ignored. So the goal was really to encourage conversations around those issues, which was a particular emphasis of this project.
And this was something that we discussed a lot at Lincoln and with GOPC and Arnab, what was a legacy city and what set Lakewood apart from other legacy cities. And I think we all expressed some interest in seeing how this process would play out in a city that is unlike Lakewood, as Allison mentioned earlier, that maybe 5 or 6 dedicated planners. But Allison, you did say earlier that you thought with a planning staff of 2 that it would be possible to follow this kind of toolkit and process.
Yeah, I mean, I was very excited about this project when Lincoln came to us and said, hey, do you think there's a way to plug in here? Because as Arnab said, so often scenario planning is at a regional level, which loses sort of that fine grained sort of lived experience that most residents have. And is also often focused on growth. So Great Ohio, I guess I didn't really properly introduce our organization. We are a nonprofit. We help communities around the state of Ohio revitalize, working at the State House, but then also doing kind of direct consulting to communities. So yeah, this I think is going to be a really important tool. And I think, to be clear, and I don't know if this has come up yet, but Arnab, this doesn't necessarily have to be driven by a city. It's helpful if it does, right? But so like that's the other thing, is that the communities that we work in, the local governments, for a variety of historical reasons we don't need to get into, right, are really depleted in terms of staff. But there are a number of other partners who are filling those vacuums in the communities that we work in. Those are community foundations, those are chambers of commerce, those are economic development agencies. And any of those entities could implement this, again, with 1 or 2 staffers. Collaboration and coordination among all those partners, I think, will make it even more effective. But yeah, this definitely, I think, could be carried out with a dedicated staff or 2. And again, I think is gonna will uncover really important, both kind of create the space for important conversations, then uncover really important next steps that a community can take. Again, no matter who's actually driving the train. So yeah, anyway, it's been a great toolkit, I think, and very applicable in many contexts.
Great. Well, thanks so much for adding that. I wanted to revisit some of your points, Sean, that you made earlier about the takeaways from this. When Arnab and I were discussing the outcomes of your project with Allison, one thing we noted, if I remember correctly, is that you had some sort of existing ideas of some work you wanted to do in the housing area, but this project really elevated the importance of that and brought things to the fore. So I was hoping if you could talk a bit about some, specific ordinances or work that maybe you saw in this project that would really benefit the city, and this project essentially helped you push forward and get momentum for.
So certainly the ordinance changes were one component, but I think the other thing that really got pushed to the forefront were the community development programs that we've been managing for many years now. So the city receives federal funding through community development block grant, CDBG, as well as then home funds. Those are our 2 main sources of funding that we receive, and there's each year there's $2.5–3 million that are available to the city for those purposes. One of the things though that we haven't done is those programs were set up back in the back in the 80s, 90s. Probably the last time they were really touched was in the 90s, and they were set up at a time when Lakewood was a very different place. That's when we were really at our peak of population loss. It was when affordable housing, we were at the high affordability end of the spectrum, to the point where there was disrepair, there was neglect, and through all that work that we did during those time periods, we've now come to a point where we started to turn the corner. You talk a lot about legacy cities and kind of where they are on that spectrum. Lakewood seems to be at that point where we're now kind of hitting the bottom of the curve, and we're starting to come back out on the other side. And so we need to really rethink about now that housing affordability is actually becoming a problem now. How do we reposition those programs from, rather than repair and rehab and maintenance, to how do we maintain and create affordable housing? And that's just an exercise that I think we all, to your point, kind of saw coming. It was something we needed to do. But it was really through this, it's like, oh wow, there's so much more we can do with these existing programs. We just need to rethink them and take advantage of the monies that are flowing into the city now.
I think that's one of the real strengths of exploratory scenario planning, as Arnab said, is that it really gives you a chance to see the value that your programs have across many possible futures. And it also can act as sort of a triaging mechanism. It can bring to the top the things that will have the most effect if implemented immediately. Well, you know, we're down to 1 minute here left in our webinar. Please feel free to add any last minute questions or comments into our Q&A. We have lots of resources and links I know we've talked about today. We're going to be sending you all a follow-up email. It will contain a link to Sean's report, a link to Arnab's Legacy SP toolkit, a link to this recording, since you all are getting CM credits for attending, and also my contact information. So you can let me know if you'd be interested in hosting a future peer exchange to discuss your work, or if you'd be interested in working with the Lincoln Institute in the various types of work that we do to include pilot projects that test scenario planning around the country. So with that, we are at the top of the hour. So thank you all so much for joining us, and you will be hearing from us shortly with lots of information. And thank you to our panelists for being here. It was great to hear from you all.